Conversations with the Mind podcast, where we explore consciousness through conversations with interesting people. Our mission is to engage the collective mind piece by piece to bring greater clarity of mind to our listeners locally and across the planet, and to contribute to broaden the shared experiential knowledge and wisdom of existence. All right, folks, welcome back to Conversations with the Mind. I'm your host, Shane Lemaster, and we're here for episode number 91 with very special guest, Matt MacKenzie. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. We're both on fall break from school, but it doesn't usually feel like much of a break when we're on a break.
No, and I am in the office because my children are doing their remote schooling at home. So some peace and quiet and a decent internet connection are helpful in this regard. So yeah, but I'm looking forward to a little bit more of a break in the next couple of days.
Yeah, I mean, I envy you in a way because you have kids, and my wife and I are trying to have kids, and but in other ways, you know, I have a couple cohort members who have kids, and they just tell me about how hard it is to get any work done when you have little ones running around and pulling at your coattails all the time. And
yeah, COVID has been, and the switching to remote schooling, and then 2 days a week, and then us at home and all of it. It's been challenging, particularly on the research front. But, you know, we're also really fortunate because we have the option to work from home or to have flexible schedules and all of that. A lot of folks are not obviously in that position. So it's hard, but it's certainly not the hardest thing.
Yeah, I can imagine, or I like to imagine anyway, like if my wife and I get pregnant in the next year or so, then we have some little tiny infants, you know, as I'm transitioning into the dissertation phase of my doctoral program next fall. And from what I hear, you know, once the coursework is done, you know, I'm just going to have so much free time to work on the dissertation. So I'm kind of looking forward to that. Maybe holding a little infant in my arms as I'm typing or as I'm doing some reading or something like that. So I won't necessarily have kids running up and asking me a bunch of different questions. So I think we're timing it just right.
Yeah, I think writing a dissertation while having young children is a very challenging task. My wife and I did not do that, thankfully. We waited until we were done to have kids. But yeah, it's difficult. You'll be sleep deprived. So, you know, trying to teach and all that with young kids at home and being sleep deprived for years on end was not always the easiest thing. It affects your consciousness and your cognition to be able to do that. It's a pretty transformative experience, but it is challenging. Maybe your readers or your listeners would be interested in my dissertation advice, which is chunk it out, do it systematically, clock in like it's your job, do it for short periods of time, and then do other things. I wrote my dissertation in 500-word chunks. I did a lot of reading and a lot of pacing around and thinking and talking, but I really just chunked it out as a numbers game because you're really cut free from the structure of being in school, and you're kind of left on your own in many ways. And so, yeah, you have to be really systematic about it.
So treating it like a job almost.
Yes, punching in and doing your writing, and hitting your numbers for the day or your time for the day or whatever it is, and then putting it away and doing it again the next day. And it's very different than the process you might have if you were writing in fits and starts or cramming at the end of the semester to write your final papers. But when it comes to doing academic research, if that's the direction somebody goes, being able to find time where you can just knock out 200 words or 100 words is critical, because you don't always have time with all the demands to you know, write for a week at a time or something like that. So learning how to write systematically is a pretty important skill that it took me, I'd say, far too long to figure out how to do successfully.
Yeah, and it doesn't seem like writing a big project like that is even linear at all. Like when I first started thinking about it, I was like, okay, I'll just start with the introduction and I'll systematically write each section in order. But yeah, it doesn't see it seems like after I'd get the introduction written and then I get into the next section, I'd want to go back to the introduction and add some pieces or, revise it. So it doesn't seem linear at all.
Yeah, I write in many ways to clarify for myself, and so I try to be pretty systematic in terms of outlining and getting the flow of thought. And I'm usually not ready to fully write until I've got at least some idea of the direction I'm heading. But of course, it always changes, and you always go back, and so it is a nonlinear process in that way. But I try to make it as systematic as I can, partly because I can't write until I have at least some sense of where I'm going and what I'm doing. Other people think by writing. They figure out what they think
Mhm.
by the writing process, and I've never quite been like that. I have to have at least some skeletal structure and direction, or else I just flounder.
Yeah, I think I'm both. So I love the outlines. Outlines save me, but I'll notice like as I'm writing a sentence, in the middle of that sentence, I'll be like, wait, my thought just changed on this whole idea. I need to go back and rewrite that whole last paragraph. Um, so speaking of consciousness, because you brought it up already, and that's what the whole premise of the show is. I only have one standardized question that I ask every single guest, and it always happens at the beginning, and that is, so the podcast is called Conversations with the Mind. And so I just want to get from you, when you hear that title or when you hear that phrase, Conversations with the Mind, what comes up for you? What sort of imagery or what sort of ideas or thoughts come up for you around that phrase?
Yeah, it is a somewhat interesting phrase. I thought I was having a conversation with Shane, but maybe I'm having a conversation with the mind, or maybe your mind. Um, yeah, I spent a lot of time thinking about the nature and structures of the mind, um, but I don't know if I've ever framed it in terms of having a conversation with this thing called the mind. Um, yeah, it's an interesting way to think about it. One thing that comes up for me right away is, well, two things. One is I think we have conversations with whole persons, not just their minds. Um, and so that might be something that's worth exploring, the question of the body and the whole self and all of that. But I'm also really fascinated by the idea that there are different kinds of minds. There's not necessarily one thing that's called the mind, right? There's mindedness and its various manifestations or its various ways. The the octopus mind
Mhm.
and the human mind are quite different. If there are aliens, then alien minds might be very different as well. So I tend to be a pluralist about what it is to be minded in the first place in many respects.
Yeah, I'm starting to feel that way too. And the more, interviews I do or the more conversations I have with folks who study this type of thing, I'm really starting to think that I need to rename the podcast. I don't know how that possible that is, or if I would lose all my current listeners. But
You've already got a brand. You
yeah,
got to
right.
stick with it.
But renaming it possibly Conversations with Consciousness
Mhm.
or something like that, because when I first started this podcast, I was in the line of thinking that the mind and consciousness were one and the same, or were like extremely closely related. And the more I dig into this, the more I'm starting to figure out that, well, the mind is just one facet of consciousness, that it's just maybe a tool to be used and refined, and just like the body is, and that it's just one little sliver under this bigger umbrella of what consciousness is. Or even there might be things above and beyond consciousness too, that consciousness is just a sliver of the rest of experience too.
Right. Yeah, and there's no, as I'm sure you'll recognize from talking to people about consciousness. There's no single definition of any of these terms. Self, consciousness, mind, experience. Um, People are using them in different ways, and even legitimately different ways. And so it's always good to try to pin it down a little bit when you're doing precise stuff. But sometimes leaving it open, textured, allows you to explore. I've over the years I used to hold a fairly traditional view in contemporary philosophy that consciousness was one sliver of what it is to be minded, right? That there, it's just the sort of surface uh, of the water, right? And then you've got the unconscious mind, and consciousness was some property or set of properties that attach to some mental states and not others, and so forth, right? That the mind or mentality was the broader category, and consciousness was when the lights go on in terms of the mind. And we know from cognitive neuroscience and other disciplines that a lot of what we're doing is unconscious, right? That there's the cognitive unconscious and so forth. So that's a fairly traditional view. But in thinking about the hard problem of consciousness and how this broader question of how consciousness fits into the fabric of reality or fits into nature, I've started to come to the view that consciousness and the mind might be distinct categories.
Mm.
Uh, Obviously, in our minds as sentient or conscious beings, they're deeply entangled. But it may be that the account of consciousness and the account of mindedness diverge in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a view that I think is interesting to explore. And I've mentioned to you before that I tend towards what's called the Life-Mind Continuity Thesis, which is that, at least in the examples of mindedness that we really know about, it's living systems, it's living beings that develop minds from an evolutionary perspective, but also as as individual living systems grow, they eventually become minded beings. And I'm quite fascinated by the way that what we call mindedness and those kinds of mental phenomena may emerge from the deeper structures of what it is to be alive. And so that's a view that as a kind of working hypothesis for me, that mindedness as we understand it, the examples that we have, is really the product of life and living systems, and it's a more sophisticated way of being alive. However, it's not at all clear to me that consciousness as such can be explained in the same way.
Sure.
That account of how mindedness may evolve out of the adaptive and flexible structures of living doesn't seem to me to solve the hard problem. And so we might need a different kind of account of why consciousness is there at all, right? That diverges from this more broadly biological account. Now, we may end up with a biological account of how consciousness arises, but I'm less sure that we're going to get that kind of account for consciousness than we are for mindedness.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you talk about it too in this developmental piece coming in, and I think it was in the last class session that we had, the last live class session that we'll ever have
Right.
for our class anyway, that we were talking about this and the idea that infants may have that surface level consciousness going on, but that I'm like an actual mind or mindedness does not emerge until they reach certain developmental stages with pattern formation and choice and decision making. And we were bringing up the idea of lying, when a kid gets a certain age and they discover lying and how they can impact someone else's consciousness, self-awareness, like all these sorts of things. That makes a lot of sense to me. And when you were talking about that, I was, you said, where or when could consciousness come in or play that role? And I'm thinking back to some of the Buddhist scripture that I've read where they talk about, as the baby passes through the entryway into our reality out of the womb, that literally as their head comes out, it's almost like they're being crowned with this consciousness, and consciousness enters in that moment. And I think that's just so beautiful. I don't think that's the whole story. And, there's one of my favorite psychedelic researchers, Dr. Stanislav Grof, has his whole perinatal matrices theory, where he talks about how infants inside the womb actually have some sense of consciousness, and maybe we forget some of those memories, but that some traumatic experiences while in the womb, whether in the mother's environment or the trauma of a C-section or something like that, can carry forward in a person's mindedness or consciousness out into adulthood, and manifest in certain psychopathological ways. And he's studied this with his psychedelic sessions, specifically LSD psychotherapy, where people will be regressed back into womb experiences and relive birth trauma, and be able to heal it, and retell themselves a different story about it, and then it totally changes their behavior afterwards.
Mm.
So these ideas around, like, where does consciousness start, and then you have like the whole like the whole abortion arguments coming in and stuff, like when does it start? Does it start when there's a few diverging cells? Like, does it start at conception? Does this so very interesting piece, I think, of that hard question. And you've been studying, I mean, you as far as I know, your whole career is based off of studying consciousness and the mind, and these aspects, right? You teach philosophy of mind. Right now I'm in your Metaphysics of the Self class. And it must be interesting for you to study a subject entirely and base a career off of it, when there are so few hard definitions of what these
Right.
things are, and no one can agree on it.
Yeah, it's an exciting field, right? It's an exciting area, and maybe a little bit about how I got into it would be helpful, because I didn't start out thinking I was going to be a philosopher of mind or a philosopher of consciousness. As you probably know from my background, I work in cross-cultural philosophy of mind, classical Indian philosophy, Buddhist philosophy, as well as contemporary stuff, and interdisciplinary philosophy of mind, really taking the empirical sciences very seriously as a partner here. But I went to graduate school to do comparative philosophy, to study Buddhism and related questions in a philosophy setting. And then I discovered, the riches of Indian thought. But I was actually training to be a philosopher of language. And partly that was because in 20th century philosophy, particularly in the English-speaking world, but in continental Europe and other places as well, language was a very central thing. And I was really interested in the nature of language and how it impacted on all these different kinds of problems, and in particular questions about realism and anti-realism. Do we construct the world, or do we recover what's there? How do we, what are our theories like? And using things about language and truth and reference and stuff to deal with those questions. And my teacher, Arundam Chakrabarty, is a classically trained Indian and Western analytic philosopher of language. So he really kind of turned me on to thinking about language in a really sophisticated way. And I did my PhD comps in Indian and Western philosophy of language, my comprehensive exams. And I thought I was going to write a dissertation on that. But I started getting interested in the nature of the mind and cognition and how it related to those things. And then I discovered sort of Indian philosophy of consciousness, and it just blew me away. And I just found it so much more interesting than the philosophy of language stuff that I was doing, which is really technical and very logic focused and sort of all this kind of stuff. But once I really started thinking about the nature of mind and experience and all of that, I just knew that that's what I wanted to do. And so I completely changed my dissertation topic and, all of that, and went into a completely different direction and did work on the theory of self-awareness in Indian philosophy and in analytic philosophy and phenomenology. And from that point on, I haven't done philosophy of language in forever. Like once you get into the nature of mind and consciousness and experience and all of that, I mean, it's all there, right? The
Yeah,
metaphysics side, the epistemology, religious experience. I mean, all of it, right? And so that, from then on, that's really been the primary lens through which I approach these things. And I do lots of things in Indian philosophy, but it's really, I think of myself as a cross-cultural philosopher of mind. I'm trying to think about the nature of mind and experience and self and consciousness by drawing on multiple traditions. So the Indian tradition, because I have training in it, has this incredibly, as you are seeing in this class and other places, has this incredibly rich history of thinking about these questions, as do Chinese philosophers and others, and trying to kind of bring that conversation together with contemporary work and history of Western, and then trying to add the empirical stuff, right? So I think nobody owns the topic of consciousness. It's not the philosophers, it's not the neuroscientists, it's not the psychologists or the theologians, right? This is at the core of what it is for us to be human and to be the kind of creatures that we are. So we kind of have to study it in an interdisciplinary way. And we have to think about it looking at the full spectrum of what human beings have thought about it, right? We have to really think about how indigenous people have thought about the nature of consciousness and the mind, or how classical Chinese thinkers or whomever, right? And so it's this huge area, and it's incredibly exciting to be part of I think as you called it too, the consciousness boom, right? It used to be the case that if you talked about consciousness, then people thought you were woo-woo, and serious people in philosophy and psychology and neuroscience and so forth didn't talk about that. We talked about cognition and information processing and epistemology and things like that. But even since I've started, the explosion of work on consciousness has been pretty incredible. And I think we're really just at the beginning, right? Like thinking about consciousness in a philosophically sophisticated way, a way that's respectful of the whole spectrum and diversity of types and states of consciousness, and integrating that with the empirical disciplines has really just started, right? And so I think it's a pretty cool time, to be working on all of those questions.
Yeah, we're just scratching the surface, and you're absolutely right. I mean, when I started my bachelor's degree, I knew I wanted to get into psychology, and I thought that was the inroad into figuring out, what our mind was all about. But when you start to go down the various rabbit holes of consciousness and mind, and from different cross-cultural perspectives, there is, to me anyway, and it sounds like to you, there's absolutely nothing else in this reality that we experience that is more interesting, more fascinating than consciousness itself, for me anyway. And I feel like it's the real final frontier for us. It's not the bottom of the ocean or deep space or anything. Like, it's consciousness itself. And someone might say, well, why don't you think deep space is the final frontier? Like, it's so much further away when consciousness is right here. Well, how are you going to experience deep space without first understanding how you experience and how how your visual processing and how all that stuff comes into play, and how mythology and all these stories are told about different constellations. Like, you can't understand those other frontiers without having an understanding, at least an experiential understanding of consciousness. And so for me, like, my path was psychology in my bachelor's degree, and then being an athlete my whole life. I had experienced flow states and sort of like this consciousness dropping out and reaching these states of pure bliss and hyper performance. And so my master's degree was in sport and performance psychology, where I really got into like the performance aspects of the mind, and how do we fine tune our brains using what we know about Olympians and high performers, so that we can all sort of have a formula or some sort of methodology to elicit more flow states,
Mhm.
really live into our full conscious potential. And then after that, there was a psychedelic reemergence, and then my passion for altered states sort of came in, and flow state is an altered state. And so all these things sort of blended together, and now I'm studying altered states in my doctoral program, and that's where I think my career is probably going to end up in the long run. So you were talking about your doctoral program and your dissertation. Did you always like, even before that, in your bachelor's degree and in high school and things like that, did you have an interest in studying consciousness or things like that, or like was it a different major in your bachelor's?
No, I was a philosopher, and part of what fascinated me, even from a young age, was I guess I've always been temperamentally a philosopher. Thinking about the big questions and arguing and debating and being drawn to these different alternative systems. And part of that was my background in martial arts. I was a serious
Yeah, I'd love to hear all about that.
Yeah, I was a serious martial artist and started Taekwondo when I was 5 and worked to second degree black belt and did competitions and all that. And I got interested in the traditions of Asia, partly just from being I was a kid in the 80s. It was the time of like ninjas and ninja movies and, Chinese Kung Fu and all that. And I was doing Taekwondo really, really seriously and, getting a black belt. And so I got really interested in Japan, actually, and samurai culture and ninjas, and then kung fu, and all of that. And it planted a seed in terms of being interested in the traditions of Asia. And then once I hit high school, like a lot of kids of a certain type, the weird kids, I was interested in, Zen and things like that, right? And reading beat poetry and Alan Watts and all that stuff, even though this was the 80s and 90s, not the 60s when people were reading, that stuff the first time around. It got me interested in sort of just looking for traditions on how to live, right? Really that sort of question of how does one live? I wasn't brought up particularly religious, and so my own religious upbringing never really stuck. And so I was sort of exploring, and then once I figured out that you can go to school and ask these questions, that there was this thing called philosophy that you can actually study, I was sold. And so I went to undergrad knowing I wanted to do philosophy, but I also got interested in anthropology. And was fascinated by culture and the evolution of human beings and all of that. So I took some anthropology and all of that. And then I had a pretty pivotal experience, which is that I went to Nepal as an undergraduate. After my first year as an undergraduate, I was 19. And I went on a summer school trip. And we trekked the Himalayas. And got to study with what I later learned were Kagyu teachers, but just Tibetan Buddhist teachers. And I was interested in Buddhism and all that. So I actually got to see these incredible landscapes of the Himalaya, right? Which is pretty mind blowing itself. And then also to see a living Buddhist culture. And I was already super interested in Buddhism and was starting to try to meditate and things like that. And it just sparked this massive interest in doing cross-cultural philosophy and learning to meditate and all of that. So that really started my journey as a meditator as well. I'm a pretty serious meditator, or at least maybe not serious, reasonably consistent meditator at first. And so that was my undergrad experience, was trying to look at, the nature of philosophy and the big questions and trying to do it cross-culturally. I was fortunate enough to be able to do cross-cultural philosophy as an undergrad a little bit and then travel in Asia. And so when it came time to to choose a graduate program, there's really one place if you want to do Asian philosophy in a philosophy department, and that's the University of Hawaii. That's the flagship institution. They've been doing East meets West since before Hawaii was, well before Hawaii was a state, since the late 1920s. The department was founded on East-West philosophy. So I went there and got really interested in studying the Buddhist tradition and then studying the whole Indian tradition there. And it wasn't there to focus on mind and consciousness. It was really the whole shebang, really understanding these traditions. But in the background, even when I got into really technical philosophy, the background, what had drawn me to these traditions to begin with, was this question of like, how do we live a wise life? Right? That really old school philosophical question that Socrates and the Stoics were on about, and Confucius was on about, and the Buddha was on about. Like, how do we live a wise life? How do we transform ourselves? How do we shape our experience? So that, as like an existential concern, has always been with me. And that's one reason why I did a ton of meditation and studied at the Zen Center in Hawaii, and studied with Tibetan teachers and some Vipassana stuff, was that sort of driving existential question about how we live. And so once I kind of shifted back towards thinking about the nature of consciousness academically, then those things really kind of came back together for me. And so I think the contemplative study of consciousness is an important piece of this as well. So I was a summer fellow at the Mind and Life Institute, which brings together primarily Tibetan. Now it's kind of broader, but it was founded by the Dalai Lama and Francisco Varela, the neurobiologist, to sort of bring together philosophical and contemplative and scientific views on consciousness. So that piece of the puzzle is something that is also really important for me. And I still maintain a daily meditation practice and think about how we can incorporate sort of first-person methods into the study of consciousness, but not just academically. Like, how do we live a deeper and wiser human life? And that's a broader question, but sort of working with our own minds is definitely part of that. And it's something that is, I think, so fundamental to the Indian traditions that you sort of take it for granted. But then you think about it in the West, and there are deep and powerful contemplative traditions in the West as well. But integrating it with things like academic study of the mind is still pretty new in the West. And people are rightfully skeptical as well, right? Because there's a lot of maybe unrigorous or not philosophically cogent or scientifically informed, sort of new agey stuff about this. But I think from a long-term perspective, part of that interdisciplinary integrated approach to studying the mind and consciousness experience has to include first-person methods, from my perspective.
Yeah.
First, second, and third person perspectives, and then having some sort of philosophical sense of how they all hang together is sort of the goal. At least that's the way I think about it. And so, having a meditation practice and having experienced deep states or altered states in various contexts definitely informs sort of how I think about this.
Yeah, such an interesting story of your journey, your path, and that it mirrors my own so much. Taekwondo was my first martial art when I was 4 years old. Got a black belt, competed at the national level, and now that you mention it, that is probably what sparked my own interest in Asian cultures. I mean, my generation is more like Ninja Turtles and things like that, but there's still, reference to Asian culture, even in the Ninja Turtles dojos and stuff in the cartoon shows. And Japan is on my bucket list of ultimate places I want to go and probably live someday. I'd love to live in Japan.
Incredible.
And Nepal and India and Tibet and all these places are places that I have to go. Like I'm just so drawn there, but never gotten over there. So yeah, very interesting parallels there. And I wanted to ask you a little bit more about this idea of living a wise life, because I think for anybody who's alive, I mean, we can all live a life, but there's a difference between living a life and living a wise life,
Mhm.
or living a life with greater purpose or greater meaning, or searching for that meaning. And you did mention the contemplative traditions, which I think are super important. Having been a meditator for 15 plus years myself, there's just so much knowledge available from the inside that you can't get in books. But you did say something that I haven't experienced myself. You said that the West and our own traditions over here, that we do have, um, you know, contemplative traditions over here, and I would love to hear more about that too, in the context of living a wise life and what that means. Because when I look around at the general population, and this is a generality or generalization, but I don't think most people spend much time thinking about the hard question, or thinking about um, consciousness, or what it means to live a wise life. I think most people are just locked into this automatic 9 to 5, just trying to not be stressed out all the time, really focused on this 3D reality, and not going inside as much as maybe we should, or maybe as much as other cultures have. So I mean, you said a lot there, and I want to unpack a lot of it, but yeah, maybe starting with what it means to live a wise life, and what it looks like here in the West to have a contemplative lens on that question.
Yeah, it's a really interesting set of questions. I mean, I guess one thing I would say is we should differentiate the traditions of a culture from the day-to-day reality
Hmm.
of people in that culture. So, if you go to Asia, people are working, they're taking care of their families, they're working jobs, or they're working in agriculture, or they're scrambling to survive. As they get wealthier, they're consuming more. They're doing what human beings do, and they may or may not be super connected to the contemplative traditions of their culture. And in the same way, I think in the West, people are in the daily grind, you know, um, and that reality on the ground is one thing. And then the question is, what kinds of traditions and resources are available in a cultural tradition or in a historical tradition? And there, I think, it's the Asian traditions that are my area of expertise. But if we look at, you know, Jewish contemplative practices, or Christian contemplative practices, or Islamic practices, there's rich resources there. But those were primarily for people who were contemplatives, right? You have all traditions that go back to the Neoplatonic traditions that continue and reemerge in the Renaissance. You have spiritual movements like the American Transcendentalists, who I'm very interested in. So there's definitely undercurrents of spirituality and contemplative resources and practices all throughout the Western tradition, and I very much include the Islamic world there. Um, but how much contact does that have with people in their day-to-day lives? Probably not that much. And I also think that even for those folks who maybe are embedded in a religious tradition, um, there's real skepticism in many religious contexts for contemplative practice. So we see that as an important difference, for example, between liberal Protestantism or Protestantism in general and, say, Catholicism, right? Like that there remains a contemplative tradition in Catholicism in a way that it's much harder to find in many kind of straightforwardly Protestant traditions. And we have an increased secularization in the West. But what I think that leads to is people searching for non-traditional means of finding a spiritual connection or finding a sense of purpose and meaning. So think about how many people do meditation, or think about how many zillions of people do yoga for all kinds of reasons. But one of them is feeling more grounded, more centered. People do self-help work, they do retreats. We've seen a kind of pluralization of all of that. And my amateur hypothesis, again, there are people who actually study this for a living, but I think some of the evidence points to the fact that as people leave traditional structures of religiosity, their need for meaning doesn't reduce. Their need for a spiritual sense of spirituality doesn't reduce. Their need for a sense of connection doesn't reduce. They just go looking elsewhere for it, for better and for worse, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's something that actually fascinates me a lot, is in the modern secular West, or really the modern secular world, think of Japan or large parts of Asia as well. How do people find a sense of meaning and purpose? I mean, I think that's a larger question that really interests me. And then thinking about what it is to live a wise life, I make no claims to, to wisdom, but it is something that, this is another side, but it's something that's becoming increasingly important for me, is this ongoing revival of the idea of philosophy as a way of life, as a search for genuine wisdom, as a path of self-development. And there's a real interesting resurgence in that in the West. And I think in many respects, it just never went away in Asia. And so we have this revival in many manifestations of people looking not so much for new religious traditions, but for a philosophy of living that actually has a practical component, that you're going back to this tradition that we certainly see in the ancient West with the Stoics and the Epicureans and the Platonists and Cynics and so forth. That philosophy was a comprehensive way of living that involved practices and ways of viewing the world and traditions of self-cultivation and all of that. There's been a really fascinating resurgence in interest in that, and actually people developing or reviving comprehensive philosophies of living. And I think part of what explains Western interest in Buddhism and yoga and Tai Chi and Taoism and all of this is people looking for a philosophy of living, right? That actually isn't just a theory, but it's a way of life. And I've always been really interested in that. And that was part of that kind of existential questioning that drew me to study Asian traditions. But what we're seeing now is a real revival of that in the world. And I think that's really, really important. And I think it fits in with some of this work about studying the nature of consciousness and experience, because it raises the question, not just what is consciousness, or what is mindedness, but what can it be, right? What can it be? You said something about fulfilling our conscious potential, right? What could it mean to live a deeper and more integrated life? What could it mean to cultivate our mind and our states of mind and experience and integrate that into the cultivation of virtue, for example, right? And living well amongst others and in the world. Those are the traditional philosophical questions, right? Not the academic stuff. Sure. And I think those questions to me remain important, and I think are increasingly so. And so I think integrating the more academic stuff with the more, shall we call it, applied consciousness research is something that's emerging, and I think it's really worthwhile. That's a very roundabout way of not answering the question what wisdom is. But I do think that part of what wisdom is the ability to recognize what is important, what is valuable, to be discerning in that respect, and then be able to act on that in an effective way.
Yeah, I've always sort of held a simple definition for myself of wisdom, and differentiating it definitely from knowledge too. And that knowledge is information or understanding, whereas wisdom is sort of putting that knowledge and understanding into action into your own life in a way that benefits you or that makes your life better. And as you're talking about philosophy of living,
Mm-hmm.
I'm like flashing back to all these different developmental periods in my own life, and I'd go through these different stages where I would be like in my high school years, I was so interested in joining the military, being a Navy SEAL, these things, and that was what I geared everything towards. Every time I did an athletics or anything, like I was thinking in the back of my mind, okay, I'm getting in shape right now for this future trial and rite of passage when I'm going to have to go do buds for SEAL training. And then it shifted, and then I found alcohol and became an alcoholic, and then my whole philosophy of living sort of morphed into how can I score the next 30 case and, reach that level of blackout drunkenness. And my whole philosophy around life, shifted and morphed around that. And then, I found recovery and I got sober. And then I was in, AA and NA and these 12-step programs. And that's a great example of like practical, how to, like, that's literally what the 12 steps is. Like, they're reteaching you how to live a life sober now, and I still keep those things integrated into my daily life, taking record of all the people I do harm day to day, and all the people that do me harm, and forgiving them, and doing reflections on that, and giving this sobriety away to others and helping others on this journey. I'm an addictions counselor, so I'm constantly giving that back to other people. So I can see how even here in the West, like, we find these philosophies of living, and for me it was based off of like what my circumstances were at the time, and how I had to adapt to survive to whatever that was, and that adaptation became a philosophy of living at that time, which then got integrated into my whole being. And now, in my mid 30s, I can see all those different periods and all the lessons learned from those different periods, and they're all hopefully somewhat integrated into who I am now, and I'm much more adaptable to whatever comes my way. But I'm still open to changing that philosophy, right? As more information and more wisdom and more understanding come in, I always want to remain open to being able to change my philosophy at the drop of a dime if something new emerges that works better.
Right. Yeah, and I think people in general, but I think certainly people in the modern period that we're in now, are searching for a structure or a sense of who they are, of what's important to them, of how to live well. That question is just built into what it is to be human, as far as I'm concerned. And we don't necessarily do a great job as a society of teaching children, for example, how to engage in that process, or how to come to a philosophy of living. And so one of the things that's sort of emerged for me over time is, how do you build a philosophy of life?
Mm.
And then how do you teach people how to build their own? And so this is a project I'm just starting to work on. The last time I taught my world philosophies class. So my world philosophies class is an intro class, and the theme has always been philosophy as a way of life. What are visions of the good life in ancient Greece or the ancient Mediterranean world, in India and China? And we only read ancient texts and about what it is to live well, and how to, what is spiritual liberation, or what is wisdom, or all of that. And the last time I taught it, I structured it so that students had to build their own philosophy of life. And so their final project was sort of this scaffolding up to them stating, and it could be that their philosophy of life is evangelical Christianity, that they already have one, but they needed to articulate it.
Mm-hmm.
And it had to have a component of, how does it affect how you actually live, not just the theory. Now, how successful that was, I don't know. We'll see. But and I'm not alone in this, but I think there's a movement amongst philosophers and a very small subset of philosophers and other people, psychologists who work on wisdom or positive psychology, that's starting, I think, to rediscover this idea that we need tools, right, to figure out how to live the examined life, right? I mean, this goes right back to the roots of philosophy when Socrates says the unexamined life is not worth living. In order for us to be fully human, we need to be able to reflectively guide how we live. You said earlier, well, anybody can live, but can you live wisely? And in a way, you could say anybody can float along in their life, but what does it mean to lead one's life?
Mm-hmm.
Right? What does it mean to take responsibility for the shape of one's life and the shape of who you become over time? And I think one of the core ideas that we find in the ancient philosophical traditions is that in order to flourish, in order to live our fullest lives, live our best lives as the kinds of beings we are, we have to become reflective. And we have to put into practice what we value most. And there's specific techniques for doing that. It might be meditation, it might be dialogue, whatever it is. So the idea of philosophy as a way of life is really kind of returning to this idea that there are these traditions of shaping oneself into a particular kind of individual through reflection and practice, and that's oriented towards some notion of the good for human beings. And I think we've lost sight of that idea. And so we retreat into dogmatism, or we retreat into addiction and abuse of substances, or shallow consumerism, or whatever it is, or anxiety. Again, I'm not a psychologist, thankfully, but we're in many respects lost. And so one side of that, I think, is how do we create shared understanding, both theoretical and practical, for how people can come to live wiser and more reflective lives,
Mm-hmm.
and develop for themselves a positive philosophy of life that's their own and that they take responsibility for, that guides them. And boy, I wish I had that when I was 16. I wish I could go back and talk to my 16-year-old self and say, hey, think about this, or do these things, take responsibility for who you're becoming. But we don't do a very good job of that in our culture, right? Or it's crammed down our throats by somebody else, right? Somebody in authority. And that's not taking responsibility for shaping your own philosophy of life either. You're just swallowing whatever somebody else has imposed on you. So yeah, I mean, we've gone far afield from the hard problem of consciousness, and whether emergentism is the right answer or whatever. But in the background of what fascinates me about these issues is these sort of larger existential questions. And I think, again, taking responsibility for your own mind and experience and cultivating that is a key part of what it is to live wisely, from my perspective.
Yeah, and I definitely want to circle back around to some of those bigger questions here in a little bit. But you brought something up which I think is an important thing to talk about, which is, when we talk about a philosophy of living, most of the time, where people's minds go is towards the individual, right? Or their own egoistic based life. How do I make my life worth living? How do I live, or have a philosophy of living? But you also brought in the idea that there's this collective of consciousness and minds out there, and different embodied beings. And if everybody is just working on themselves with no sense of some sort of integration of good for everybody, doing good for me so that I can do better for others, so I can serve others, then we're left with purely egoistic beings running around and not caring about anyone else. So I guess I want to ask you, like, what is how do you put those two together? What is your view on that? Is one, a lot of traditions sort of hierarchically rank them, that the collective is more important. You should be giving more and thinking about others more than you think of yourself. Um, and there's other traditions that say, no, you should start with yourself first, and then only then you'll be able to go out and influence the collective. Um, but I think they both are essential. They're two sides of the same coin. Um, yeah. Do you think one is more important than the other, or how that gets integrated?
Yeah, it's a really, I mean, I think these are some of the most fundamental philosophical questions. And one of the reasons, one way to see that is that as soon as we see the emergence of philosophical traditions that are really reflecting about what it is to be human and how should we live, and whether it's the Upanishads or Confucianism or Socrates or whomever, they're already thinking about the individual and the social,
Mhm.
right? Because that's such a deep part of the human condition, is that we're both individuals and we're social, right? And so there's different ways that people have tried to answer that, but that it's an issue. The reconciliation of one's own individual life with the interdependence with and dependence on others and the society, it becomes really central. Um, and my thinking about that has changed over time. But I think one of the insights that I've always gleaned from the philosophical traditions I've studied is that we have to recognize that you can't be fully who you are unless you are recognizing your interconnectedness with the world, with other people, with the past, with the future. You because living wisely as an individual involves having a clear understanding of who we are and what our situation is. And our situation is very clearly one in which we are deeply interwoven with the world, with other human beings, with the natural world, with historical and cultural traditions. So to find out who we are is also to find out how deeply embedded we are in all of these, right? But I think the danger from that perspective is that we then just bleed out into some collective networky mush. The flip side of the coin is that we are individuals. We're individuals who are interdependent, right? But we're still individuals. And the way I think about that is that it's a fundamental fact that only you can live your life. Literally no one else can live your life for you. It doesn't make any sense. People can try to make you do stuff, but it's just a metaphysical fact, I think. It's certainly an existential fact that only you can live your life, right? And so you have to take responsibility for your individuality, because no one can live your life for you. And so if you refuse to live it, then no one's living your life, right?
Mhm.
Your life just floats along, right? It's wasted because the only person who can live it is refusing to do so out of confusion or anxiety or numbing themselves or whatever it is. So I think keeping in mind these two existential facts, that only you can live your life, no one else can do it for you. And so if you don't do it, it's a wasted life on the one hand, and that what it is to live a life is to live in this interdependent network. Keeping those two kind of double-barreled insights is sort of where I've landed. And sometimes it's more important to emphasize interdependence and the social, and sometimes it's more important to emphasize, that at the end of the day, living one's life well means living one's life,
Mhm.
right? So I think the other side of this, right, is that you can't live well as a human being in nearly any circumstance unless you live well with others, right? And this was the insight of the ancient eudaimonistic tradition, the Greek tradition of human flourishing, is they recognize that we're social animals. And so to live my life well means I have to treat others well, right? And so that's the key, I think, to recognizing that individualism is different from egoism.
Mhm.
Egoism is thinking that what's in your interest is somehow fundamentally and always in conflict with the interests of others, and so just pursuing your narrow self-interest in all things. But what all the ancient philosophers to one degree or another realized was that I can't live my life well, unless I treat others well. The classic example here in the West is friendship, right? Aristotle is going to say, all the Greeks thought friendship was one of the most powerful and important aspects of human flourishing. But you can't be a good friend if you're a selfish jerk. You have to genuinely care about the other person for their own sake. So in order for me to flourish as an individual, I have to have good friends. And in order to be a good friend, I have to give a crap about other people for their own sake. I can't be a selfish jerk. So in order for me to flourish, I can't do it in this narrow, selfish way.
Yeah.
We certainly see this in the ancient Indian traditions and the ancient Chinese traditions. They were even more social. But I think that's a profound insight, that I can't be fully who I am unless I'm also recognizing that other people have the same status as me and have their lives to live and need to be respected, and that my flourishing is interdependent with theirs. We easily forget this. I certainly do. But it is an insight that I come back to a lot in trying to reconcile those two things.
Yeah. So I think part of that too is just to put it out there that I think that there's a time and a place to put others before ourselves. And there's also a time and a place to put ourselves before others, depending on what the situation calls for.
Right.
For sure, in my recovery, I had to put myself first. Otherwise I wouldn't have survived,
Right.
but now, being 11 and a half years sober, I can put others before myself and still be okay and actually thrive even more when I do that. So yeah, I think there's a balance there, and I think both are necessary. And I think that the context and the situation will determine what needs to be done. So you did mention your background in Indian philosophy, and I wanted to start circling back around to some of these big, hard questions of consciousness. And I thought we'd start there, and then eventually lead into some of your recent concepts and writings around the self and consciousness and things like that. And so I had what I thought to be some significant background in Buddhist philosophy, things like that. I've had a number of folks who've graduated from Naropa University come on the show and really lay out some of the the Buddhist constructs, birth, life, rebirth, karmic cycle, nirvana, all these things. But I haven't had anybody on yet who can really dig into Indian philosophy. And that was one thing that struck me as being pretty profound, having taken your class, is that I didn't really study much into Hinduism or any of the Indian philosophies. And one in particular stood out to me, and, you led me to a few books, and I ended up, spending a few $100s this semester on new reading material, which I'm very thankful for. Books are one of my favorite investments to get. So, but the Advaitin tradition, and the way that you described it, and the way that some of the readings described it, I was wondering if you can go into that for some of the listeners. Maybe just, I know it's super complex, but break it down in its basic forms, and maybe we can explore some of the implications of some of these Indian philosophers and how they were thinking about the realms of reality.
Sure. Yeah. And Advaita is one of the fascinating traditions. And, the Advaita tradition is also one that has converts in the West and spiritual teachers like the Buddhist tradition. Advaita has come West in various forms. It's another of the rich contemplative traditions of India. But Advaita Vedanta is one of the 6 classical systems of Indian philosophy. And I won't go through all of them, but it's just one, as we've seen, and it's got specific theoretical ideas and motivations and so forth. But the term Vedanta in its name means the end point of the Vedas, Veda Anta. And that means both what comes at the end of the Vedas, that is the Upanishads, but it's also like the highest teaching, the point of it all, right?
Yeah, so maybe could you just explain to the listeners what the Vedas and the
Sure.
Upanishads are, so they know what the end of what
Right.
we're talking about is?
Yeah. So the Vedas are the ancient scriptures and oral traditions that come at the origins of Hinduism, right? And there's controversy about how old they are and what their origins are. The mainstream scholarly opinion is that these were the religious and oral traditions of the Indo-European speaking folks in particularly North India that probably came down from the Russian steppes and so forth, with their classification of people into the priests and the warrior kings and the farmers and so forth. And so these traditions are at the origin. These are the scriptures that are memorized and chanted and stuff by Hindu Brahmins. And what we see in the Upanishads is a set of scripture or set of texts that are really I think the origins of what we now think of as Indian philosophy and spirituality. So many of them are dialogues with wise people or gurus in the forest or between wandering philosophers and kings or queens. There's puzzle cases and reflection on the nature of the self and spiritual liberation and the ultimate origin of everything. And you really see the beginnings of spiritual and philosophical reflection. And these are wisdom texts in effect. And there's a number of them, like the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, the Great Forest Upanishad, and so forth. So these are the origins of what we characteristically think of as Hindu spirituality in many respects, thinking about liberation, rebirth, Brahman, the ultimate nature of things, and so on. We find those in the Upanishads. And so Vedanta, as a system, takes the understanding and philosophical articulation and defense of the teachings of the Upanishads as its central task. So it's really looking back to the wisdom literature of its tradition and trying to develop that into a systematic philosophy and a kind of contemplative system as well, a system of liberation. And so you'll see, commentaries on the Upanishads and so forth as part of that. And the term Advaita means not two-ness. Dva is two, same root as TWO, right? Two is two. And so it literally means not two-ness. So it is the non-dual school of commentary and understanding of the Upanishads. So that's the sort of Indian philosophy version of that. And so a lot of what your listeners might associate with Hindu spiritual ideas, that everything is one, that at the core of oneself is the core of everything, that the world may be some kind of illusion, or that separation is a kind of illusion. Those are really Advaita teachings, and they're not found. And in fact, they're vigorously disputed by other Indian traditions. But often what has come west is some version of this sort of non-dual teaching in India. So what the Advaitins were interested in was understanding the ultimate nature of reality and the ultimate source and principle of everything, which is traditionally called Brahman, and the connection between the ultimate nature of things and our innermost nature, which is often called Atman or self. But particularly for the Advaitins, that means the innermost reality of what we are, right? Because as we've discussed in the class, they differentiate our deepest innermost reality from our psychology, right? Our psyche, the mind and the self and all of that is actually a function of the body. And what we are in the deepest sense is Atman, the self with a capital S. And their key teaching, going back to the Upanishads, is, you may have heard this expression, it's a Mahavakya, a great saying, Tat Tvam Asi, that thou art.
Mm.
And this goes back to the Upanishads, and the Advaitins take it literally. That the ultimate nature of things, Brahman, is what you truly and most fundamentally are. Your deepest nature is identical to the deepest nature of reality itself.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't even mean I'm a little spark thrown off by the fire of being, right? Or I'm kind of similar, or I'm made in the image of. They mean literally the inner core of what you are is one and the same thing as the most fundamental nature of reality itself.
So, just to pause real quick,
Yeah.
being one and the same, and so I read this book. It's on my bookshelf. I'm looking at it right now. It's called The Holographic Universe. So and I've talked about it on the podcast before, but the holographic theory of reality being that every, in a hologram, each little pixel of a hologram contains the entire image. And so in this sense, if your inner core, that inner core self, is one and the same as ultimate reality, it could almost be similar to this holographic theory where, you are sort of, you're a fractal of, or you're not even a reflection of, because a reflection is not the actual thing being reflected.
Right.
But yeah, a lot of these modern theories seem to coincide very closely with some of these ancient theories in that way.
I think what an Advaitin would say is that your body mind, right, the mental functions and bodily functions that characterize you as a person, might be, fractally related or holographically related to the ground or source. But that's not true of Atman, because a holographic image or a little bit of a network is not identical to reality itself. They mean identity in the strongest possible sense. There is only Brahman, and your innermost nature is the one reality, the only thing that exists. So you're not a little spark, you're not a holographic reproduction, you're not a node in the network, none of that. There is, at the end of the day, there is only pure eternal consciousness, and your innermost nature is that. It's not a piece of it or a network of it or a hologram of it. It is it. There are other non-dual views and qualified views that do want to take a position like you are a piece of the greater whole, or you are a spark that emerges from the ground, or you are a creation of God or something. Advaita is utterly uncompromising in its non-dualism. Right? So Atman is Brahman in the strongest possible sense, and recognizing that is the key to liberation. You're not your body, you're not your mind. You are pure consciousness, and there's only one pure consciousness, and it's reality itself. Full stop.
So then what you said, if there's only one pure consciousness and you are that pure consciousness, there are other people out there, right? So
and that's right.
Yeah.
And other people are the world, Jagat, right? And Jagat is a mere appearance of
the illusion.
It's part of the illusion. And so you are not Shane LeMaster, right? That's your body. That's this particular body mind that, refracts the light of consciousness, that lights up its interior domains, right? But what you really are is just consciousness. And so there aren't little bits of consciousness that are mine and yours, right? So I think the analogy that works best for me, and it's a classical one, is, take a pot, and there's some space inside the pot, right? And then you smash the pot. What happened to the space inside the pot?
And it's still there.
And was the space inside the pot ever really different from the rest of space?
No,
there was just a container that seemed to be dividing the space that belongs to the pot from all the rest of space. Yeah. But that's not really what was happening. Right. And so, consciousness for them is like that space. It is the space of existence. It is the framework, the matrix of existence. And so the fact that it appears at one level that there's some consciousness that's yours inside you is like, you know, the space inside the pot. And your body mind is just the clay pot, right? And consciousness doesn't, or the space doesn't really belong to the pot at all. Right? It's not even a property of the pot. And so when the pot goes away, nothing happens to the consciousness, or nothing happens to the space. And so they're quite uncompromising about that non-duality. There are other traditions that take a different tack. But it is a fascinating view because there is only being, consciousness, bliss, Sat Chidananda. And the world, what we think of as the world, is an appearance. How much of it is an erroneous appearance is up for a great deal of debate, even in Advaita, and there are different views on that. But it's an appearance in the sense that it's not the final and full reality. And so our bodies, the world that we study in science and so forth, are the world. They're the world of appearances. What's fascinating, one thing that's fascinating about Advaita is they're absolute idealists, right? Reality is ultimately consciousness, right? It's mental in the broad sense. But they constantly attacked the Buddhists for being insufficiently realist about the objective external world and other people, right? They, the Advaitins were what in the West we would call absolute idealists, and the school of thought that they debated most in the Buddhist context was the Yogacharans, who were, according to the Advaitins, subjective idealists. They wanted to say that the world that we seem to observe around us is just a function of our individual streams of consciousness, like a group hallucination. And the Advaitins relentlessly attacked this. The world for Advaitins is independent of my mind and your mind. And it's just as objective. And we can study it objectively through various methods because it's actually, relative to us, it's out there. It's on a par, right? It's as real. It's not a projection of my mind or your mind. It's a real, at its level, it's a real domain. It's just that ultimately everything, us, our minds, the world that we study, all of those are mere appearance, right? But at the practical level, where here we are on this Zoom podcast talking about consciousness or whatever, right? The desk in front of me is completely real, independently of my particular mind or wishes or whatever. It's not a projection of my mind. So there's a world out there, right? It's just that the world isn't ultimately real, but then neither am I. So it's not less real than me, right? Yeah. So it's very interesting that they were idealists, but they were very keen to have a kind of practical realism about the external world and our ability to perceive it and study it and explore it. And they had a theory of knowledge that said, we learn more and more about the world and we revise our beliefs, right? And we explore the domain of appearances, right? Through all of these different means. But what is true knowledge, what is the highest knowledge, is that which can't be overturned, no matter how far we explore, no matter how deep we go, no matter how many times we revise our beliefs. There are certain things that will not be overturned. And one of those, maybe the most important one, is the existence of consciousness itself. From their perspective, there's no amount of information we would learn about the brain or astrophysics or quantum mechanics or whatever that would overturn the idea that there is consciousness, and that consciousness is the absolute presupposition of all further knowledge. So we can't learn about quantum mechanics or astrophysics or the immune system or 17th century art or whatever unless we're conscious. So there's no epistemic facts. There's no facts basically that we would discover about the world that would make us go, oh, you know what? We're not actually conscious after all, right?
Yeah, and that's why I was saying I think it's the final frontier.
Right. And they don't want to say everything is consciousness in that you flip over a rock and there's consciousness or something, right? Consciousness is the ground of being. So, and rocks are rocks, right? It's an appearance, it's an objective appearance of consciousness. But, we can learn all kinds of stuff about the way the brain works and how information systems work and whatever, you name it. And from their perspective, none of that could ever falsify the idea that we're always already consciousness. And so one of their arguments for why consciousness is ultimate reality is it's undeniable. Mm-hmm. It's unoverturnable by future investigation. And I think this intersects with the hard problem in an interesting way, because one way of framing the hard problem is no matter how much we learn about the nature of the brain or the nature of us as physiological systems or about information processing or whatever, we can always ask, yeah, but why is it conscious? Right? And no matter how fine-grained that information gets, well, it's whole brain synchrony at 40 hertz that is associated with consciousness. And then you ask, well, okay, but why is electrochemical activity at 40 hertz in the brain associated with consciousness? No, but you see, it's 40 hertz. Well, okay, but what is it about 40 hertz that entails that phenomenal consciousness would be associated with that? And just describing in finer and finer detail the electrochemical properties never gets you any closer. Mm-hmm. That's one way of thinking about it, right? You can just go indefinitely in that direction and get more and more and more and more fine-grained understanding of the structure and function of some physiological system or some information processing architecture or whatever it is. And the same question keeps popping up. Okay, but why is that associated with consciousness at all, right? And an Advaitin might say, well, there's an in-principle reason why no further amount of information about the nature of the world, whether it's quantum mechanics or neuroscience or whatever, will ever entail consciousness, because there is no entailment. It's a presupposition, mm-hmm. right? And so you're looking in the wrong way. It's like you're going this direction on a parallel line, right? But the answer is up this direction. Mm-hmm. You can go indefinitely far in that direction, but it's never going to, depending on what your geometry is like, it's not going to get you this other answer. Now, maybe that's not the right answer. Maybe that's not the right approach. But I think one fascinating thing to me about studying these ancient systems from India is that they often have really important insights that are still relevant today for how to think about the mind, or how to think about even investigation into the mind, right? Yeah. So I think, with Advaita, and I'm not endorsing Advaita as a philosophy, but they have some interesting and powerful sort of approaches to this.
Yeah, I think my favorite part about the Advaitin way of thinking, if I'm correct in my analysis of it, is, if we are pure consciousness, and everything is pure consciousness, it's sort of, I don't know. So I'm studying the mystical state experience, right? Which is commonly defined or thought of as experiencing of that unity consciousness, that pure bliss consciousness. And I feel like I've experienced that quite a few times in altered states, whether it be meditation or breath work or psychedelics or something like that. But the experience of that pure consciousness and having like an ontological understanding that is what we are, it just is so beautiful to me for a number of reasons. And one of those being is that, I was sort of brought up, in Western Christian tradition. My mom never forced it on me, but, she put us in Sunday school to get rid of us for the day or whatever. And so I had this stuff like jammed down my throat where, there's this God outside of you that is this all-powerful being. And then we're automatically put in a spot of subservient or subjugated status to this other being, right? Which holds power over us. But in this view of, we are pure consciousness, that we are one and the same, it really gives you a sense of that agency, that ownership back over, Timothy Leary would say, you are, or you are your own God. And it sort of gives you that feeling that if you are pure consciousness and that is everything, well, then you really do have more power than you think to change everything about yourself, everything you think about yourself, everything around you in the world. Like, um, I think it's just a really comforting and beautiful thought to have, as opposed to, Western dogmatic thinking where we're subjugated, but instead it gives you back your own power once you realize that you are everything. And so I
So
just love that.
this is an interesting, I think we see some of this in the reception of Indian spirituality in the West, particularly as it intersects with somebody like Timothy Leary or the hippie movement or the psychedelic movement. There's a danger. And that danger is thinking, okay, well, I'm pure consciousness, which is ultimate reality. And so I'm my own God or something like that. The danger is confusing the ego self with pure consciousness. So an Advaitin would never, ever say, I, Matt MacKenzie,
Mm-hmm.
am God because I am the ultimate reality, because I'm not the ultimate reality. Pure consciousness is the ultimate reality, which is distinct from me as a body-mind complex. I'm just this body-mind complex that's a mere appearance. And pure consciousness will take on another form of body-mind complex in the next life. So the danger would be to inflate the ego self and turn it into God or turn it into the ultimate, rather than recognizing that who I normally identify myself with, my own likes, my own dislikes, my own drive, my own needs, is not who I really am. And so the worry with these kinds of traditions, and it can happen in any tradition, is it creates a kind of spiritual megalomania.
Mm-hmm.
Because then the guru or whoever thinks they're Brahman, but then they're confusing the ultimate reality with their jiva, their individual self, and then that creates that's even worse, right? Because then they go on this crazy power trip, right? So you are ultimate because you are not your body, mind, and your likes and your dislikes and your psyche. Your psyche is never ultimate,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it is liberating on the one hand, but also disorienting, because you get to be ultimate reality, but then in order to be ultimate reality, you don't get to be Shane the Master anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You have to keep that guy in context, right?
Sure.
Right, and keep perspective on that. And part of the issue that we see in Indian philosophy is how do you reconcile the spiritual and the world, right? If you think that the highest good is ultimate liberation from samsara, from the cycle of existence, either through recognizing that you're a divine creature of God, or that you're Brahman or whatever, right? You're the pure consciousness that stands alone in the yogic tradition, whatever it is, you have this reconciliation of a spiritual ideal that somehow takes you out of the world with how should I be in the world? And I think this is actually what the Bhagavad Gita is about as a text, is reconciling spiritual liberation with living in an uncertain and conflicted world. And one of the key texts that the Advaitins take as part of their corpus that they need to comment on and have an understanding of is that text. And so this problem of, as an individuated person with consciousness, a jiva as they call it, right? How do you live, right? A virtuous life, a wise life, has to be reconciled with this idea that ultimately the world is a mere appearance and there's only consciousness. Mm-hmm. Right? So, but okay, great. But then here you are still in the world where you have to pay your bills and you have kids, and you right, that plane doesn't just magically go away for most of us, right? And even for those who are liberated, they still see the play, they say, even though they have this constant recognition that it's mere appearance, right? They still have to, as long as they're embodied, have to live amongst the appearances. So one school of thought in Advaita talks about what's called jivan mukti, living liberation. That is, what is it for me to be liberated or spiritually free as a flesh and blood conscious being? And part of that is that constant recognition that the ultimate reality is this space of pure consciousness, and then living in the world in light of that fact, right? And that for them, I think, means being part of a tradition of wisdom, having these scriptural texts, having pretty traditional morality, right? Hindu morality, right? Cultivating purity and virtue and so forth. These are ways of cultivating and expressing one's liberating insight in the world. You see a similar kind of problem in the Buddhist tradition, right? Where how does if a Buddha recognizes that it's all impermanent and there's no self, well then how does the Buddha go on living, right? Or if you're a later Buddhist and you think like, everything is empty of inherent existence, okay, well then how can you live compassionately in a world where you also recognize that in some sense it's an illusory appearance, right? Those are hard questions. I have no good answers to them, but they were on the radar of all of these traditions. So even if you have this very revisionist idea, oh, it's all one big consciousness, you still have to not be a jerk to like your partner or not yell at your kids or pay the bills or deal with conflict, and so those problems don't magically disappear even if you wake up to oneness. The other side of this, I think, for Advaita is unlike some of the maybe westernized spiritual traditions and some of the even ones we find in India, just having an experience of pure consciousness is not enough for them. You actually have to cognitively come to realize, right, that all is one and that separation and distinction are mere appearances. So they don't think you can have a enlightenment experience and then that's it. Traditional Advaitins, actually, you have to come to a cognitive realization, wisdom, jnana, and that requires philosophy. It requires philosophical argument and understanding of why there cannot be differentiation and plurality at the ultimate level. Yeah. So it can't just be an interior meditative experience. It's got to be the combination of this interior meditative experience and like basically straight ahead theoretical understanding and wisdom.
Yeah. Yeah. And I remember one of our conversations after class, I was giving you an example of, after these profound oneness experiences, I mean, you have to come back and try and integrate that information into your daily living, or else, that information doesn't really do you any good. And so after I've done some integration with it, I think the example that I shared with you is like, I'll be having a conversation with somebody and being in the conversation, in that interaction, in my Jiva self, my Shaila masterness, having a conversation with my wife or something like that. But then my brain will like switch modes and it'll be like, oh yeah, ultimate reality, and it'll remind me that, that this is an illusion and that this conversation might not be happening, that might be an illusion. And so my brain will like try and hold both of those things at the same time. And I don't know if it's switching back quickly back and forth into those modes of consciousness, or if it is actually holding them both at the same time. But, I'll find myself walking through campus and just being my normal self, feeling the ground underneath my feet. And then boom, in the next instant, I'll be feeling or thinking that, am I really on campus? Or, is this, and I'll switch into this like pure mode of consciousness. And so back and forth or simultaneously holding those at the same time. That's been an interesting exercise or exploration that I've been trying to dig into a little bit.
Yeah, from a meditative perspective, you can get into spaces where you almost have like two tracks, right? And this, if you've done some kind of standard Vipassana style meditation, or a meditation tradition that's closer to Advaita, which is witnessing meditation, effectively, from my perspective, what you're doing is you're coming to rest or implicitly identify with the space of awareness rather than its changing contents. And we see this in Buddhist traditions as well, right? And we see it in Advaita, that we, in fact, both use this analogy of sky-like awareness, open, spacious awareness, and so forth. And forget the metaphysics, just phenomenologically, right? Like if you start to identify less with the passing contents of your conscious awareness and more with just being aware, then you can, like a Gestalt switch, like the duck rabbit, right? You can switch and, I'm just the space of awareness. There's just this space of awareness and the contents come and go. And then next thing you know, you're hooked into, oh, but that guy's a jerk, right? I might be the space of awareness, but that guy cut me off in traffic, or whatever it is. But I think it's just a structural, phenomenological feature of our conscious minds that we both have the space of conscious awareness that, at least as long as we're awake, remains continuous, or at least it seems continuous to us. I think it probably is continuous, right? But then the contents of it are constantly changing. And I think the key insight of many Indian meditative traditions is to loosen, right, the automatic identification with the contents of consciousness, right, and come to rest as, or recognize oneself more and more as just the awareness in which those contents are coming and going. And there's different flavors of that and different ways of doing it, but I think that's a core technique, core sort of restructuring or changing the style of our experience. The clearest example here is in Patanjali's yoga, right? He defines yoga as chitta vritti nirodha, the cessation of the modifications of consciousness. And when the shifting modifications of consciousness calm down, oneself as the seer is revealed. And I take that as a straightforward phenomenological description of what it's like to calm down the mind and recognize oneself as the space of awareness rather than its contents.
Yeah.
And he calls that the witness, or the seer, drashtu or drashtri, which just means to see. But he means the light of consciousness, right? Which is, for like in Advaita, is the true self. And you don't have to buy any of their metaphysics to recognize that it is in fact possible through meditation to be less hooked and less consistently identified with what is appearing in consciousness, and more identified in some way with just being conscious. Now, of course, the question is, why would that be useful? Like, so what? Like, okay, now you used to identify with this thing and now you identify with this other thing. Who cares? But I think a lot of us who have meditated recognize that there's an equanimity that can be found in resting as the space of awareness rather than being constantly embroiled in its contents. You get sucked in, you get pulled along into craving and grasping and all the things when we habitually identify with those contents. And so, I guess in psychology, you would call it cognitive diffusion, right? You defuse, you become less hooked into these contents. And when you can do that, you open up this space of freedom, calmness and freedom that allows you to be more responsive when you do respond. And I think that's a shared insight of Buddhists and other broadly yogic traditions. And I mean that Jain yoga, yogic meaning techniques of self-development that work with consciousness. They're not always doing that. Sometimes they're focusing on concentration, right, or whatever. But these kind of open monitoring styles of meditation are really good at this. And if you practice it consistently, you can click into this idea of being the space of awareness.
Yeah, I've even noticed the more I practice the awareness piece, being that pure awareness, I notice that the effect isn't only in my waking consciousness, but even in my dream world, in my dream life. I'll snap, like in the middle of a dream, I'll snap out of being, whatever jiva self is being represented in that dream, and all of a sudden I'll be lucid dreaming and have complete control over the environment, or I can shapeshift into something else, or just have an awareness that, oh, I'm dreaming, or oh, I'm in an unconscious state, or something like that. So I think it's interesting how, we're talking about tradition and the philosophy of living, but also having practices and things that you can actually do to develop greater and greater awareness or greater understanding of all this information, and how it doesn't only apply to just waking consciousness. It can also go into other realms of consciousness. I use my meditative practices, especially mindfulness, in altered states, to be able to get my grounding, to be able to navigate those spaces much better and gain more information to bring back. So I think it's just interesting, and really points to how important it is for people out there to find a philosophy that works for you, and to find some handful of practices that you can do that works for you to help develop that. And I wanted to sort of adjust and shift just a little bit for the last 25 minutes or so of our podcast, and really start to give you the floor to dig into your own concepts around all these things we've talked about. And I think that's really important to do because, like you said, we stand on the shoulders of giants before us, and a really important piece of understanding what consciousness and the self and ultimate reality is for us now in this modern age is also understanding how it's been talked about by everybody else before us. And so your theory of all this stuff, and I hope you're okay talking about it since it's still an unpublished draft, but we just read it last week in class, the Embodied Luminosity chapter. I can see in your writing how you bring all these important people and traditions to the table and give them their due respect. And I can also see how those ideas and conceptualizations sort of bleed into your own ideas too. And so I'm wondering if you can, for the listeners out there, share, not just from this reading, but this reading is a really important one, I think. What, how you conceptualize it, especially as like a network, and all these different aspects that we've sort of touched on already today.
Yeah. So shameless plug, I'm writing a book. I've been working on this book for a long time, but the tentative title is Embodied Luminosity, because I'm combining the traditions of India that think about consciousness in terms of luminosity, and the embodied cognition literature that's developed in the West, and trying to kind of think through all these issues of subjectivity and self and experience and cognition and all of that kind of in dialogue with Indian traditions and this tradition of embodied and enactive kind of approaches that we see developing in the West. So I guess one way to start would be that perhaps a little bit unusually, we were talking at the beginning of the podcast about maybe differentiating consciousness and mind. Mm-hmm. But I also want to differentiate consciousness and self. Mm-hmm. A lot of folks intuitively, but also in various theories that we have, want to see maybe if they're strong believers in the existence of a self, maybe want to think of consciousness as a property or capacity of this thing called the self. But as I'll say in a minute, I think consciousness is prior to self in a certain way. So I actually want to give different accounts of consciousness and self. So maybe I'll start with consciousness and circle back to self. The chapter I'm rewriting now, which you haven't read, but is actually on the nature of consciousness. And I call my theory dynamic, embodied, open presence. It's not the most attractive name, but there's a couple of elements of this. The first, it actually relates to exactly what we were just talking about. Thinking about consciousness, phenomenal consciousness, as more like a field or space in terms of its structure. It's an opening, right? It's an opening rather than a kind of paint that attaches to cognitions or something, right? And that really comes out of the meditative and philosophical traditions of India, really seeing consciousness as spacious awareness, as an open field in which things can come to appearance. So part of what I'm interested in is what would it be like to kind of rigorously think through consciousness as an opening space or field, and then integrate that with our understanding of the neurodynamics of consciousness and its phenomenological structure and intentionality and all these things. But my starting point is really that consciousness is open presence. It is that which allows things to come into phenomenal appearance. And that when we investigate it, first personally, we find that it has this spacious or field-like structure, right? It's like a clearing in which things can appear and disappear, right? Not just visual things, the space of the appearance of the body, right? It's a framework or opening.
So like pure potentiality field.
You could think about it as potentiality, but it's lucid. This comes right out of that. You see this in Mahamudra and Dzogchen, in Advaita traditions, that consciousness is a lucid expanse. It's a luminous expanse. Well, luminous because it lights things up. It allows them to come into appearance. And so I want to kind of start from that idea. But we also find that the examples of consciousness that we know about, individual consciousness, there may be a big consciousness too, I don't know. But certainly our consciousness is deeply connected to our body and what it means to be embodied. And that probably a core part of the neurobiology that underpins individual consciousness is the homeodynamic and self-regulating features of the body. And so I want to think about consciousness not as just a free-floating opening, but as an opening that is embodied in some way. And it's dynamic because its contents are constantly coming and going and changing, but also it has a kind of temporal structure, right? That there is a flow of temporality in the stream of consciousness, right? Now there may be modes of consciousness where a sense of time falls away, there's timeless experiences or what have you, but day to day, the idea of a stream of consciousness, that one experience flows into the next, right, is something that I think is really important to capture. So I take consciousness to be, at least individual consciousness, to be a kind of opening, right, open awareness within which various phenomenal things can appear, that has a particular structure in the moment and has a particular structure over time, and trying to sort of dig into sort of how all those pieces fit together. I mean, I can go into further detail, but that's the sort of the basic starting point. And then I think what our typical mode of consciousness involves is the co-appearance of objects and aspects of our own subjectivity, right? They're both appearing typically locked together in these ways, and they're appearing within this broader open space of awareness. So trying to really dig into the phenomenological structure of that, but also how that intersects with arguments in the philosophy of mind and so forth. And a key part of that for me is that I think consciousness is reflexive, that being conscious means in some sense being aware of one's own awareness. Not reflectively aware, not thinking about it, but I'm aware of being conscious just by being conscious. And so unlike being a stone or a table, when I'm conscious, I'm aware of that consciousness just by being in that state, just by living through it. So it's got this self-luminosity aspect of it that the Advaitins agree with, that we find in yoga, and then we also find in certain schools of Buddhism, that in one way or another, consciousness presents itself and presents its own contents without needing any further higher order cognitive structure.
So it doesn't necessarily require objective objects or the ability to interact with them in order to reflect that, oh, I am seeing this thing, therefore I am a seer of this thing, therefore I have some sort of source of the seer. You know, it doesn't require the objective world, even though the objective world is there and we're still interacting through our sensory modalities, and
Right.
that's a piece of it, but it's not necessary component.
Yeah, so I think that to be, a conscious state is one that we're in some sense aware of being in, and that awareness is built into the structure of consciousness
Mhm.
itself. So all awareness is awareness of awareness
Mhm.
in this primitive sense, and that's what actually constitutes having a conscious perspective. And so you have a kind of minimal subjectivity built into the nature of consciousness. Consciousness is not hidden from itself, at least in terms of its own existence. And so that's one reason why I don't have to check whether I'm having conscious experiences. I may have to check whether I'm dreaming or not, like in lucid dreaming.
Mhm.
But if I ask you right now, are you phenomenally conscious? And you say, I'm not sure, let me check. Right. Well, what would you do to check? And is it the kind of thing that you could have been mistaken about? And so it doesn't ever happen in the dark because it is the light itself. And it needs no further light to make its own presence known as it reveals other things.
Mhm.
But the way it reveals itself is not the way objects reveal themselves. It reveals itself by being that to which objects are presented.
Mhm.
That sounds all very fancy, but what it really means is that consciousness is reflexively structured. It's aware of its own activity and its own existence just by being itself. And we don't know of anything else that's like that. And that's one reason why consciousness is so weird, because we keep trying to assimilate it to things that are mere objects. And it's just not that kind of phenomenon.
Mhm.
So I have this idea that consciousness is this reflexive open space of luminosity, and luminosity just means the ability to present something phenomenally, right? The capacity to allow anything to show up and experience it all, right? And that's when you talk about it as a potential, right? Consciousness is that condition in which trees can appear when we perceive them. It doesn't create the tree. It's that condition that allows trees to be phenomenally present, right? Because if there were no conscious beings, let's say that there were still trees, well, they wouldn't be phenomenally present. They just exist,
Mm.
right? But in order for them to be phenomenally present, for them to be experientially manifest, there has to be the condition of conscious awareness that allows that to happen. So that's what I mean by its luminosity, right? That's a very old Indian idea that I kind of pick up as a thread. So that's one side of it. And I don't have a locked down theory of the origin of this. I don't know why there is conscious experience, or how far down it goes, or anything. I don't know. And so that's why I want to look at how it shows up for those of us who are conscious. But I do, as you alluded to, have a kind of emerging theory of the self, and I've been working on this for a long time, and I published on it. But I think what we think of as our psychological selves really emerges evolutionarily. It emerges through our interaction with the world and other people, and it emerges through various psychological stages. So it is a kind of emergent psychological construct that has to do with the nature of our body, but also the way in which we interact with others and the world around us. And in fact, the function of the self, from my perspective, is to facilitate flexible, intelligent responsiveness to others in the world. That's its role psychologically, is that it allows beings that grow selves, in my sense, to have a network of capacities, right, that allow it to more flexibly respond to the conditions of life. So it's an adaptation in that sense,
Mhm.
right? We evolve selves because they're useful for our functioning as embodied creatures.
So, in that being opposed to like other schools of thought that think that the self has like an ultimate purpose, whereas yours is just that it's an emergent usefulness.
Mhm.
Um, for interaction with the world.
Yeah. And so I'm a kind of pragmatic functionalist about selves, in the sense that I think the self is a network of these capacities for, subjective consciousness, which already exists, a sense of ownership, a sense of agency, a sense of value, or what is relevant or salient for the system. And when those are working together in a particular kind of way, in an integrated fashion, then the system as a whole can do stuff that it otherwise couldn't do. And when you think of complex selves like human selves, think of things like imagination and long-term planning.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's not something that a goldfish can do because it doesn't have the cognitive machinery to do it. But we do. And that is organized, I think, around what we call ourselves. You project yourself into the future or into the past or into imaginative situations. You have a long-term planning perspective, which requires certain kinds of memory, right? Autobiographical, you have a sense of yourself over time and so forth. But you can also have very complex sense of what's valuable to you, right? There are things that are valuable to goldfish, but it's a pretty small set. And it's pretty simple and it's pretty in the moment. But if you care about the further reaches of consciousness or the nature of ultimate reality or the deepest structures of mathematics, that's a much fancier set of values. And I think what a self does is it is the locus point, the organizing point around which we can sort of perform all of these different things, acting, having a sense of ownership, understanding and creating and pursuing what is valuable, and so on.
So yeah, and if the self is sort of this adaptation that emerges, how does meaning and purpose in one's life come into play there, where, as individuated selves, we may feel like I am here on this planet to achieve these things and to help change these people and help make the world a better place. But that seems like it's a much greater meaning or value placed on the self itself, as opposed to it just being some emergent property of this network.
Yeah, so I guess what I would say is what we want is an explanation of how anybody could ever do something like think that they're here for a purpose and then pursue that purpose. Like what are the psychological capacities that a being would have to have in order to be able to do something like that?
Sure.
Right? And that's a different question from is that true? Or should they do that? Right? Those are further downstream questions, but how could we be even in a position to ask that? Right? Or have a sense of a purpose and meaning. And so I think to be a self is to be the kind of being that can do stuff like that can formulate goals based on what they value and then pursue them systematically over time, for example. Think of all the psychological machinery that's necessary to do that. You have to have a sense of what you value. You have to have a sense of who you are. You have to integrate those things over time. You have to remember your past. You have to project into the future. You have to respond cognitively and behaviorally to others. That's a really fancy suite of psychological machinery, right? Or fancy suite of psychological capacities. And what a self does is it becomes the organizing hub or network around which a life is constructed. And it keeps the thread going of that life as well, keeps it coherent and integrated, right? And so pathologies of the self are often literally fraying or coming apart. That is, you're disintegrating. And so I think of the self as a kind of integrating function of these different capacities that allows it a much greater scope of flexibility and responsiveness. And I think, dogs have selves or whatever, but human selves are especially important because we have language, we have long-term memory, we have abstraction capacities and so forth that really set us apart. We become truly rational, reflective beings. So, and I think part of what falls out of my theory of the self is if agency, valuation, and ownership are central to what it is to be a self, then human beings are going to be the kind of beings that have to have a sense of goal and purpose and value, right? Otherwise, we're just rocks,
Mm-hmm.
right? To be me is to have some sense of what I do and what goals I pursue and who I am and how those relate to who I am and what I want, a sense of ownership, and what stuff matters.
Mm-hmm.
We're the kinds of beings for whom things matter, right?
Yeah.
All kinds of things. It could be anything. It could be Pokemon, right? It doesn't matter. Like, but we're mattering beings, right? Like things matter to us and we pursue what we do partly because of how it matters to us. And so to build a life, to lead a life, is to integrate those in a coherent and reflective and reasonable way. But you could be terrible at living and still have ownership, agency, and value and subjectivity, because otherwise there's no one home from my perspective, right? You're not a self, and you may do a terrible job of living your life. You may pursue the wrong things in the wrong ways for the wrong reasons, but that there are things that you find worth pursuing, right? It presupposes that you have this capacity to value. Yeah. So I think selves emerge through our embodied history and our embodied perceptual and cognitive and affective interaction with other human beings and the world around us, and it grows and develops and integrates over time. And then this larger question is, well, I mean, in a sense, my view of the self is just a kind of embodied cognition update of this Indian view that the narrow self, the ahamkara, the I maker, right, is a kind of construct, right? And I'm fine with that. I think it is a kind of construct, and it may not be the deepest nature of what we are.
Sure.
Right. And if you're on the kind of Hindu side of the register, philosophically, you might say, well, the self is whatever it turns out to be your true nature. And so this kind of network of capacities, of psychological capacities that I'm talking about as the self, would be like the false self or the small self, the ego self, the ahamkara, the jiva. And the real self is whatever they take your true nature to be. I don't go there because I'm trying to sort of dialogue with different people about what a self is, psychologists and phenomenologists and other people. But it may very well turn out, it's consistent with my theory that this network of what it is to be a self isn't the deepest or most fundamental fact about what we are.
Sure.
So
yeah,
I don't make that claim, but I think it's consistent with it.
Yeah, and you mentioned this aspect of a construct, and my mind went right to what we've studied about the narrative self, and the story that we tell about our life, our history, all these things, lessons learned, and that in and of itself is a construct, right? The story itself is constructed by us to give us a sense of meaning and experience over time and things. But I wanted to, last thing I wanted to touch on here in your paper that we read is about this network, right? I love the theory, the pattern theory that we read, and these network theories that we're starting to bring in, because earlier in the semester we were looking at other theories that sort of zeroed in on one thing that was the self, but it's so almost like narrow-minded to believe that it's just that one thing. And so I love these network theories that are, I think you asked, like, in class, like, is this cheating? Like bringing in all these different theories. Like, I don't think it's cheating at all. Like, I think in order to get a full conceptualization of what it is that we're talking about here, it has to be a bunch of different things. But also that this network is not a static thing. It's constantly changing, and that the emerging self is not just a static thing that you can put your finger on, but it's a process. It's an unfolding process over time. In your paper, you mentioned And this was in reference to biochemistry, but the term autopoiesis,
Mhm.
which I was having a little trouble just trying to figure out what that meant in and of itself. But there's this sentence that you said, you were talking about the logical bootstrap or this loop and this process, and you were in regards to autopoiesis, you said the process creates a boundary and is subsequently constrained by that boundary, right? So it's a boundary creator that's sort of like the pot, like holds the space. And my mind went right away to thinking about like performance psychology and pushing our potentials to realize greater and greater things. And if it is such, this network or this process is a boundary creator, and we're constrained by that boundary, well, we got to find ways to like expand our boundary out more and more and
You
more.
can expand the boundary, but if you
Yeah,
don't have a boundary, then you're not a system.
yeah, exactly.
So remember that the autopoiesis stuff comes out of biology.
Hmm.
So Varela and Maturana, who kind of coined this term, autopoiesis just means self-creation.
Mm.
They were trying to understand what life is, literal biological life. And so the example of creating a boundary is literally a cell wall.
Hmm.
And so you have these autocatalytic chemical reactions that are, feeding into each other, this kind of feedback system of chemicals in this kind of recursive structure, but it's not alive yet. To make it alive, like if we're thinking about a cell has to actually use those recursive feedback processes to create a boundary between the recursive system and the world,
Hmm.
so that certain kinds of processes internal to the system that are required for the system to continue can be protected from the onslaught of matter and energy from the outside world, right? And so the boundary creates the container within which the internal dynamics of the system can develop. But, and this is really crucial, it's not just a container, it's an interface. And it has to be both. It has to be an interface with the world,
Hmm.
and it has to be a wall, right? A boundary that hermetically seals the system is not a living boundary, right? And so maybe the system will continue, but it won't interact with the world.
Right, like our skin is a boundary to our body, but it
It
responds to the
it is
environment.
also our
Yeah.
our point of contact with the world, and
Yeah.
so it's always these both of these things. And so you get the creation of a boundary for the system that differentiates the system from the world. It gives that self-other kind of differentiation. But the system can only be the system that it is by continually engaging with the world, literally through matter and energy turnover. It has to metabolize, which means it has to take in energy, use that energy, and get rid of it. So only if you are permeable to the world and interacting with it can you continue to live. And only if you have some boundary between yourself and the world can you live. This, I think, maybe goes back to that question about the individual versus the network that we were talking about at a much higher level of
Mhm.
abstraction. Well, to be alive is to be both this individual that has to have boundaries and has to have its own internal dynamics, and also equally has to be constantly interacting with the world. But it has to interact with the world on its own terms, right? It has to eat what it needs to eat in the right amount, sense, right? And so what more complex living systems do is they don't just have this interface with the world. They figure out how to internally regulate the various processes inside them, metabolize differently or respond differently to what they sense is going on in the world. And then the next step is that they become able to regulate not just internally what's going on, but regulate how they are interacting with the environment, right? And so that's a kind of meta capacity where you can not just self-regulate, you can regulate how you interact with the
Mhm.
world. And then you can regulate how you interact with the world, right? You can build recursively up. And for an activists who study this, they want to say that the roots of cognition are in that move from internal self-regulation to adaptivity.
Mm-hmm.
the ability to change how you respond as the environment changes. Because very simple systems only have like rote responses. You poke them and they do this, or you poke them and they do that.
Mm-hmm.
They can't meta regulate how they respond. They can just respond to input. But complex systems can adapt how they respond. And once you get that process moving, then you have the capacity for flexible adaptation and innovation of adaptation. You build that for a couple billion years and you get systems that build machines so we can talk to each other about consciousness, right?
Yeah.
And so part of this goes back to that life-mind continuity thesis we were talking about at the very beginning, that what we think of as mindedness is actually a set of tools that complex self-organizing systems have figured out evolutionarily over time to become more and more flexible and intelligently adaptive to the world. And this is where we haven't talked about this, and we're getting to the end, but this is where the whole pragmatist tradition is really core for me.
Mm.
That's the silent partner in our conversation so far, is trying to understand how we can become conscious, moral, aesthetic, active, social beings in all of our complexity, and how beings like us could have come out of the world like this, nature, not by reducing us to something less, but asking how can the full range of human capacity and experience have evolved from nature as we see it and understand it, right?
Yeah.
And that's a really key project here. And part of that is that what we think of as thinking and being minded and having experiences really is intelligent, adaptive responsiveness to navigating a complex world. And the trick of that, though, is that we also have an internal perspective on that. So it's like something for us to navigate this world in our bodies and our societies and all of that. Mm-hmm. So experience, for me, is both that internal subjective living through it and the whole suite of human responsiveness, intelligent behavior, or intelligent interaction with the world.
Yeah. So last short question, I promise. And you've been very gracious with your time. I want to thank you for that. So back to this boundary piece,
Right.
and the idea of, expanding the boundary, and by expanding our boundaries, therefore expanding our capabilities, our knowledge, our ability to gain knowledge, expanding our boundary into different dimensions of time and space and understanding things like that. So I want to just ask this question in regards to both consciousness, right, as the presupposition of anything, which seems like consciousness in that sense is boundaryless, period, like it can't have boundaries, and then the self being different than consciousness, and also having some sort of boundary, being that first personness. So if we are going to expand, so say, and I don't know, maybe you have a different answer for the consciousness piece. Maybe we can expand our boundaries of consciousness, maybe not, but in more particular to the boundaries of self and what we have as our individual or collective selves. Like if we are to evolve as a species, evolve as individual or collective selves, and expand that boundary, could there be such a thing? In different traditions, they talk about boundarylessness, things like that. And you said without boundaries, you can't live. So is true boundarylessness even possible? Or at that point, do we just stop living and just become part of this pure consciousness?
Yeah, we would just dissolve into whatever. Yeah, there's a lot there. So I think two things. I suspect, this is just a suspicion, I suspect that consciousness is more central to the fabric of reality than most of us recognize. That doesn't commit me to saying consciousness is the source of everything or what, but I think something like consciousness is probably more deeply interwoven into the fabric of things than current mainstream theories realize. Again, I could be wrong about that. But this also partly comes out of that American tradition that says that consciousness doesn't, at least for some of them, James and Whitehead and Peirce and others basically say consciousness never pops into existence. It only gets more complex, right? There's a kind of continuity, an evolutionary continuity. Dewey thinks it does eventually just emerge, right? But it may be right that the kind of naturalism, I see myself as a philosophical naturalist of a broad sense, but the kind of naturalism that will be adequate to understanding the full spectrum of what we are is one that takes consciousness to be more fundamental to the fabric of nature than certainly materialism recognizes. Maybe it's panpsychism, maybe it's something else, I don't know. I have no official view on that, but that's my suspicion. So that's one thing. And that means that if consciousness used to be very simple and it gets richer and more full spectrum as it becomes more, is expressed by more complex beings, then there may be upper boundaries of consciousness that we don't understand. I'm certainly not alone in that kind of view. So that might be right. When it comes to the self is an adaptive tool. And it's scaffolded by the world and other people and culture and language and institutions. And so if we want to evolve ourselves, we actually, I think, need to evolve the way we learn how to lead our own lives, what kinds of imaginative possibilities we hold for what we can become. But we also have to take a really hard-nosed look at the realities of human psychology and not be utopians and say, okay, what actually works for making people wiser and more integrated and more virtuous, right? And it may not be grand utopian schemes or whatever. It might just be really hard work, right? And so I think if we're trying to evolve our sense of self, the ticket for me is actually to think about time differently. And basically think, if we can manage not to kill ourselves and wipe out the human race, how many more millions of years do we have to potentially be around? And the ticket for me is to increase our time horizons. You were talking about, well, who cares about deep space? I actually think deep space is really important.
Yeah,
because we're the only intelligent, conscious, reflectively intelligent, conscious beings in the neighborhood, as far as we know, right? Dolphins, maybe, whatever. But like in terms of having culture, in terms of having morality, we're the one example of reflective, intelligent life in this neck of the woods that we've found so far. If we recognize that that's unbelievably valuable, maybe the source of everything else that we could possibly value, that it might be really important for us not to kill ourselves and to spread ourselves as far as we can go.
Mm-hmm.
Not tomorrow. I'm not Elon Musk. But learning how to, as you said, sort of realize our full potential does, I think, require taking a humble view and a view that has much longer time horizons. Rather than thinking we're at the end of history looking back, we should think of ourselves as just babies, having only really been doing this civilization thing for about 10,000 years. And if we manage not to screw it up and kill ourselves and wipe out the planet, which we might very well, right? We might have another million years to work at this whole being human business, right? And so it can be very hard to not look backwards. We have this glitch cognitively that we think all the good stuff has already happened before and we're at the end of things all the time. And maybe we are, right? But really, we potentially have a really long time to continue the human project, or the project of human civilization. So we might want to put our heads together cross-culturally and interdisciplinarily, right? To ask, how do we figure out how to be human in a wiser and more integrated way? How do we figure that out? And rather than assuming that we're so modern and we're so fancy and we've got it all figured out, and weren't those people in the past ridiculous? What if we think we're just babies? We're barely emerging into what it might mean to be fully human, right? And so that we need to like work really hard at that going forward.
Yeah.
So that would be my shift in perspective that I would recommend.
Yeah. And I think that's a good place to end it for today. And I want to say thank you again for being so gracious with your time. And it was a blast. I love talking about this stuff. I can't stop thinking about this stuff every single day. So sitting down with you today and talking about it, and I'm sure the listeners are going to get a lot out of it. But again, thank you. And for all you listeners out there, if you didn't take anything, I mean, we did a lot today. If you didn't take anything else, it's time to take a look at your life, find some philosophy to live by, including practices, and to find a way to lead a good life as opposed to just living a good life. Take that agency back, take that responsibility over yourself, and put some more effort into it. I guarantee you it will turn out to your benefit and probably to the benefit of all those around you. So until next time, this has been Conversations with the Mind, and we'll talk to you later. Conversations with the Mind podcast is sponsored by mindops.com. You can find us at www.mind-ops.com. We're an eclectic counseling company providing mental health and mental performance services to individuals, small and large groups, teams, businesses, military, through face-to-face sessions or at a distance using phone or confidential video chat apps. We bring a unique Buddhist Western lens and specialize in general psychotherapy for all mental difficulties, sport and performance psychology for performance enhancement, addiction counseling for any maladaptive or destructive habits, and psychedelic integration therapy to make the most from your visionary medicine work. We are available as well for corporate workshops to address the needs of your employees' wellness.